Jeff Hartley, who will be our moderator today. Jeff is the Director of Audience Development for the Omaha World Herald. He's also served as a Director of Consumer Revenue on the corporate staff for Morris Publishing Group. He's a frequent speaker at many industry conferences and a friend of Mather Economics. With that, I welcome Jeff Hartley.
Hey, thanks, Sean. Really appreciate that. Hello, everybody. Thanks for your time today. And I have to say I'm very glad to be back with you again as a moderator for another Mather discussion. And today's webinar is a really good one. The art and science of revenue forecasting, my opinion, is about as timely as it can get, as most of us already are or soon will be in the throes of budgeting. So we've got a great panel and topics on tap to talk to you about today, and we're going to get started with that just as soon as we go over a few housekeeping items. The first one, and I know you know this, your active participation is so important throughout this session. And during the presentation today, I'm going to be managing the chat functionality, so please enter your questions and comments in the question box throughout the presentation, and I promise I'll read those aloud before we're done and get some answers or some discussion on those. Also, as a reminder, we always record these presentations, and we're going to do that again today. So if you look at the next slide, here's our agenda for today, or our plan for the discussion. And I know I don't need to tell you this, but if there was ever a time when getting the revenue budgeting or forecasting process as accurate as possible, it's now. With the emphasis on consumer revenue growing more important every day, and in some newspapers already comprising 40 to 50% of their overall revenue, it's easy to see how getting this right matters. And then factor in on top of the normal budgeting process things like premium additions or mid-year pricing changes, and you get the idea of how much more complicated this process is, as well as how much more important that it is. In Omaha, we've seen both of those this year. We've moved, we've always had premium additions, but we're moving those into more of an all-in pricing model. We also had we shortened the cycle to a degree on our normal price increases. So those two things alone made our forecasting process very, very complicated. And of course, we turned to Mather to help us to determine the impact of all those changes on our revenue projections. So before I introduce our two panelists for today, let me say this. One of the things that has always made a webinar valuable to me is to not only hear from the creator of the solution, but also from someone that uses the solution as well. And if you've ever attended a Mather webinar, you know that's the formula, that's standard operating procedure for them. To put it simply, I want to hear what the solution is, and then I want to hear or learn the validation of that solution. And our two panelists today do just that. So let me introduce them. Matthew is the Director of Consulting Services at Mather Economics and actually played a role in the development of this forecasting tool. Brian Howell is the Director of Consumer Revenue Management for Trunk. Brian has works with all of their newspapers to optimize Mather programs. And Brian's worked with Mather for about 11 years now and has worked closely with Matthew and his team in implementing the budgeting tool for all of their newspapers earlier this year. So Matthew, Brian, welcome to both of you, and thank you for lending us your expertise today.
Thanks. Absolutely. Really appreciate that.
All right, we have housekeeping rules discussed, introductions complete. Guys, why don't we go ahead and dive right in?
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Jeff. So we're going to start out with just a high-level objective review of our budgeting approach. We'll dig a little bit deeper into the details and how we kind of arrive at these revenue numbers. But first, it seems fairly obvious, but really the objective of our revenue forecasting tools are really just to provide the most accurate and dependable revenue forecast we can. And we do that through a consistent and data-driven process. So here at Mather, we have weekly subscriber data for over 500 newspapers across the country and several others kind of spread out throughout the rest of the globe. But we rely very heavily on that data to build these forecasts and update these forecasts. The value add as a product of working with us on these sorts of revenue forecasts are several-fold. The first one is it allows you the ability to identify contingency options for covering revenue shortfalls. So we do get a lot of calls, as you can imagine, from markets throughout the country that may be mid-year, and they recognize the fact that they may be well under their original forecast through the end of the year. And our flexible model gives you the ability to go in and pull on different levers to see what you can do, not only on pricing, but on acquisition and on retention initiatives to really try to make up that revenue. The second one here is that it allows you to get a little more granular in how you identify attrition rates. A lot of markets have a very good idea about what their overall retention is or what their overall attrition is going to be at any given time. But some markets struggle with kind of breaking that out, in terms of their core subs or core market, and that of their new starts or their acquisitions. And so what we do is we take a pretty granular approach here, and we do in fact go back through the data and calculate attrition rates for different subscriber groups. The third one here is that it's pretty normal for us or standard operating procedure to provide incremental revenue projections for all of our markets that we work with on the market-based pricing side. But some of our markets have a tough time translating those incremental revenue forecasts to their entire overall home delivery revenue budget. And one of the benefits of our budgeting tools is that we blend those incremental revenue forecasts into your whole budget. And the last one here, among several others, is that our budgeting tool can help you identify the run rate going into next year, both in terms of rate and volume. So it seems like, in our experience, the budgeting season gets earlier and earlier every year, and a lot of markets, the further you go out from the end of the year, have a tougher time kind of figuring out, where to start their next year's budget at in terms of volume and rate. And our tools can be a helpful component in generating those. Brian, did you want to touch on any of these or any ones that in particular that were important to you guys when you decided to work with us on the budgeting tool?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all four bullets that you list at the bottom there for the value add were important to us as we went into this. I mean, like everybody listening, forecasting and budgeting is a huge part of everybody's job. And like you said, it seems like it creeps up earlier and earlier on us every year, but it's constantly, we're reflashing, reforecasting. I know a lot of people that have, their own kind of homegrown revenue models, myself included. And, it's really just difficult to internally report and feel comfortable with, something that gets to the level of what this tool does. I mean, it's not as simple as saying, hey, we had one more start than we had stops last week, so our revenue should be up. All of those different components that roll into the revenue forecast act and behave much differently from one another. So this tool, what we've seen as we've put this in play across our company, is that it's incredibly accurate. We have a lot of faith in it. It's something that if we need to answer a question very simply, it's as simple as spending 10 minutes in the model itself and spitting out a fairly accurate answer just to give, a market lead or a VP some sense of direction of whether they should pursue what we're talking about or maybe go in a different direction.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
Matthew, I just got a quick question for you. I talked about some mid-year price changes that might not be part of the budget, but I just thought of, can you account for other variables? One that comes to mind is in markets where where seasonality might actually become a part of the mix.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and the answer is yes, we absolutely can. So we've developed some formulas to account for seasonality in markets where that's applicable. Essentially what we'll do is we'll go back through our subscriber histories and see where the volume of stops has occurred throughout the course of the year, and we'll adjust our weekly attrition forecasts based off those seasonal factors, which will inflate attrition in certain parts of the year and sort of deflate it in other parts of the year where people are coming back into the market and not stopping at such a high rate. But it's certainly a component of our budget. We can do that for you guys.
Thanks. Thank you.
So then the next piece here is really our approach. So there's a few things that we try to focus on when it comes to approaching the revenue model. The first one is that we rely both on historical analysis, historical data, as well as forward-looking expectations. And so we try our best to blend those two things to generate a forecast that's going to be as accurate as possible for the upcoming year. Then the next one is flexibility. And so one of our biggest challenges and one of the things we focus on the most is creating a model that's as flexible as possible. And the reason we do that is we know markets, it's very important for markets to be able to quickly and easily test changes to their strategies in a variety of different ways, both on the acquisition side, the retention side, and pricing. It's very important for markets to be able to do that very quickly and get an accurate forecast as a result. And so that's something that we build into our models. Another one is just that we definitely believe in keeping the budget as updated as possible, and usually that means we're updating our forecast with actuals from the revenue that or the data that we receive weekly. In some cases it's monthly, but it depends on the preference of the market. And so that way you're not leaning on a static old forecast that was built several months ago. You have the most up-to-date data to work off of and make decisions off of. Second to last here is that whenever you engage with Mather, and Brian kind of touched on it, you have access to subject matter experts here at the office. We have about 30 analytics personnel here, all with a great degree of expertise in the newspaper field, and they work with this data day in and day out. And so all of that data that goes into the budgeting tool is always backed up by their expertise, and you can pick up the phone and call us anytime, and we're obviously happy to work on things with you. And the last one, which I value quite highly, is just, we try to achieve accuracy through simplicity, and so I'm a big believer in not overcomplicating things unnecessarily. And so really what that allows us to do is eliminate the shocks from the budget, things that you can't really account for. So we kind of take the long-term view, and we try to apply weighted averages and smooth averages to kind of arrive at accuracy through more of an aggregated view.
Yeah, and just to kind of, Matthew, I'll jump in if that's okay. Just to kind of play up on that accuracy, that was a huge piece for us from the client perspective. And one, as we've gone through this with Matthew and with his team is, if you're an existing Mather client, they obviously have, troves of historical data on your subscriber base. So before we went live with any of this, obviously the vetting process is key in all of this. And, we would take a first swing at it. If we saw some variables, we would adjust. And it usually comes down to, one of a handful of different topics, that you can hone in on to see where the variable is. But we solved it every time, 9 markets wide. And, it was well over 99% accuracy, versus, confirming versus our internal revenue reports. So that's absolutely the piece in here from my perspective is the accuracy that makes it an easy thing to buy into.
That's a great point.
Yeah, Matthew. I'm sorry, Matthew. You mentioned earlier I think about the updating of the budget, so you've got some really fresh numbers. Is there a general rule for how often you guys send an update to the newspaper?
Yeah, so we send the updates kind of based off the discretion of the market lead, but we prefer to send them weekly, and the reason for that is we generally receive weekly updates of subscriber snapshot data from the market. So if you're already working with us on the market-based pricing side, you know that we send you normally a weekly target file of expected renewals. And what we'll do is we format weekly data as a part of that process, and we'll just go ahead and use that formatted data to update the budget as well. And we'll send this budget out as if it were just a weekly report, same as the reporting process for the market-based pricing program.
That makes sense. One last question just on this topic, and I'm sure a lot of the people on the phone today have had to do this, but in the past I've had to actually build several versions of the budget. In some cases multiple scenarios that I might have to have handy depending on what was happening in other parts of our business. Can you guys do that? Could you help us project multiple scenarios of the budget?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jeff. So that's one of the things that makes this budgeting process fairly unique is, and Brian can attest to this too, because we do it fairly often for his team. But depending on different business rules that are being speculated on, at the executive level, we can go ahead and run those different business rules through the budget and save different scenarios to display. That could be anything from market-based pricing business rules, if you wanted to price every 6 months instead of every 12 months, or if you wanted to front-load pricing this year, or if you wanted to add or subtract premium days. All of those things can be incorporated in the budget, and we can summarize those things for your executive team.
Yeah, I mean, I'll vouch for that. I mean, we have 9 different markets, and the variety between them is substantial. I mean, we have the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, and then we have, some weekly community papers that we also have this tool for. And, the business rules, as you can imagine, vary greatly. The competitive landscape and the acquisition strategy, varies greatly. The seasonality tool that you touched on just earlier is a huge, huge piece for our Florida markets. So, like I said, we customized each one, got it to a point where it's incredibly accurate, but it's off of a wide variety of different business cases.
Thanks, Brian. Excellent. Thanks, guys. So next we're going to kind of move into what we're calling the art and science of revenue forecasting. And so when we talk about the art of the home delivery budget, really what we're talking about here at Mather is deciding on which inputs to focus on and what should be included in this whole budgeting process. And so we try to simplify things as much as possible, as I touched on earlier, but we really rely on 3 main pillars or components of the makeup of the forecast. The first one is just pricing, and so obviously we have a lot of experience in the pricing realm on yield management, things of that nature. But what we're trying to do here is really look at how the incremental revenue from renewal pricing within the market is going to contribute to the entire home delivery forecast. The next one is new starts, and so this is a blend of kind of leveraging our internal data and looking and working with the market to figure out what kind of budget do they have for acquisition next year, how many starts are they anticipating starting next year throughout the course of the next 52 weeks. And so a lot of times the market will come back to us and say, hey, we have a pretty decent idea of how aggressive we can be on acquisition, but can you take a look at last year and see if this is realistic? So a lot of times we'll come back to the market and say, that start forecast looks a little bit unrealistic, but we'd be happy to run a couple scenarios if you're able to achieve that starts number. But here's a number that's more in line with what happened last year and kind of figure out where the deltas are. And the last one is retention, and this is probably the most important component when you're talking about small changes really making a very significant impact on overall revenue. And so the retention component is really where we rely very heavily on our historical data in the market. We'll go back and actually calculate weekly attrition values for a variety of different subscriber groups, including your core subs, those that have been with you for 5 years or more. We'll kind of look at the intermediate subs, so subs that have been with you a few years but not quite that 5+ year mark. And then we'll also take a look at, obviously, your new starts and any other groups that exhibit very different behavior from your base. And so sometimes that can be samples or subscribers that are on very low rates because they came on via special acquisition offers. So that's really, when we talk about the art of forecasting, it's kind of figuring out which of these pieces are we going to include to what degree. And so the science then is really kind of where the rubber meets the road. We're going to take a look in the next couple slides at actual screenshots from one of our forecasting products just to kind of see how we approach these things. So the science is really taking those three main pillars and figuring out how they come together, to blend together to generate a forecast. So the first one I want to go over here is the data input tab. And so our forecasts are quite simple in terms of the size of the worksheets and the number of tabs that are included. We try our best to limit the number of moving parts to eliminate that unnecessary complexity. But the main core component of our budgets is the data input tab. And so what makes us unique is that we consolidate all of the inputs to the budget, every single one, into one location. And so, we've had the opportunity to see some internal budgets from different markets for comparison, and a lot of times there are dozens or even hundreds of inputs spread out across several tabs or even several workbooks. And so we've really made it a key focal point to reduce that complexity and bring everything into a consolidated location. So the first thing we do when we start with a market in this type of forecast scenario is we come to this tab and we need to generate a few metrics. And this is kind of where we look back at that historical data and combine that with the expectations from the market to fill this tab out. So there's a few primary components. We have our volume here. And so we'll break volume out into a few categories that make sense. You have your base, your newer starts, and some of your low price subs that could be samples. We'll take a look at the average rates that are being paid by those subscribers in those different buckets. We'll also take a look at the average increase that's being applied through the market-based pricing program. And then we'll combine that with a couple of schedules, the first schedule being the actual expiration schedule for the following year, so we have some sort of expectation of how many subs can be priced upon renewal. And then we'll also we'll work with the market to get a new start forecast by week, and we'll keep that updated weekly. But the biggest component here that's probably most important is the actual calculated attrition. And so we'll actually individually calculate attrition for all the subscriber buckets that we break out. So it's not only your core, but it's also your new starts, and all of that gets blended into an overall budget tab. And I know, Brian, this is a tab that you work with quite a bit with your team, just testing out different scenarios and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, we do. And, the key is obviously the left-hand column. And, the granularity really kind of jumps out at you right here when you just look at the volume counts at the top for the base, the newbie, the low price. And this varies, by market, how you categorize certain things. In some markets, it may be some sort of a fundraising program that's a low price, whereas others, maybe it's a Groupon. We can categorize all of those how we want. But then as you go below and you see what the average weekly price is and weekly revenue contribution, you can see how these things, all volume is definitely not created equal. And that's been a big piece as we've gone through this is really, everybody's game on this call is volume and revenue. And, volume for the most part is all treated fairly equally. Revenue from that volume varies drastically. You have a core group of customers that are paying you a much, much higher rate normally than, what you're doing on the acquisition side. Some markets handle acquisition in kind of a twofold. They have a revenue generating acquisition business, and then they have a volume generating acquisition business. And this really allows you to break that apart and see what the impact is. And then if you need to build contingencies, you can absolutely layer that into this to get a full effect from a revenue perspective as well.
That's a great point, Brian. So like Brian mentioned, this can be customized dependent upon the unique situation of your market. And so depending on which market that you were to look at, with this type of budget, you may see a couple of extra columns here. You may see seasonality incorporated. But it's highly customized. But the key is that the approach is the same, regardless of the size of the market or where it's at in the country. We really take the same approach, and that's really the key. So the next tab here is that first pillar of the budgeting process, and so we're talking about Mather revenue or pricing revenue. And so one of the keys to our forecasting process is obviously trying to figure out how much revenue our dynamic pricing process can generate. And then also, once we know that, how do we kind of build that into the weekly core revenue of the market? And so this is what this tab is meant to do. And so those of you that work with us on the pricing side are familiar with this type of format. It's a part of our kind of weekly incremental revenue forecast. But really what we do here is we're pulling in the expected expires there in that gray column. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at your subscriber base, forecast out for the following year, how many subs we can expect to impact on any given week. And then we'll take a look based off your recommendation as well as ours, kind of what the average increase to the market is going to be. In this case, it's 24%. And then we'll take these inputs from the input tab based off the attrition assumptions, the annual retention, as well as some pricing sensitivity assumptions that we've calculated from your reporting, and generate a forecast for how much revenue we can expect from the program. And you can see out there to the right, there's a little bit of a matrix. It looks like a triangle, and that's just what that's doing is it's forecasting revenue for every single week, for every single cohort of targets that we would send through the program. And so that includes both the gross revenue that we expect to earn, as well as taking out some of the contra revenue factors that would be things like pricing-related stops or just normal attrition, reverts back to their original rate, et cetera. So that's really one of the keys. One of the benefits of this tab here is that users can really quickly test different strategies in terms of, or different scenarios, to Jeff's point, in terms of their pricing program. So you could perhaps say you wanted to change the schedule of your expires, say you wanted to front load that more at the beginning of the year, or if you wanted to change the average increase, you could do that as well. You could also experiment with changing the size of the control group. So sometimes when markets are having a difficult year in terms of revenue, one of the strings that we can pull is just adjusting the size of the control group a little bit to generate more pricing targets. So all of those things can be incorporated to generate a pricing forecast. This tab here is pretty simple, but it's really just looking at the same sort of schedule, but only for new starts. So I mentioned prior that we'll work with the market to get some sort of expectation for what their budgeted new start schedule is going to look like for the following year. One of the keys here is that we actually, since we update these budgets weekly, we can track the delta between what was expected versus what actually happened. So in this case, we have actuals kind of built in for this market through this screenshot, and you can kind of see here it's very interesting to see for the first few months of the year, it looked like end of January through middle of March, this market was missing their starts forecast by anywhere from 100 to 300 accounts per week. But it looks like at the end of March going into April and most of April, it was actually the opposite. They were outperforming their forecast. So one of the benefits of this sort of tab is that you can quickly go in and see where your market-wide acquisition initiatives are working, which ones aren't, kind of based on the timeline. And you can back into the things, the differences that you need to take corrective action. And so obviously we also have the calculated retention and attrition numbers built in to give you an idea of, even though you're starting a full 962 on week 1, obviously you're going to have some attrition off of that. So we can give you a pretty good expectation based off of what we saw last year, how many of those new starts are going to be still around at the time you finish up the year.
Yeah, and to Matthew's point, you can adjust this on the fly. So if you change your acquisition strategy, maybe you're selling longer term offers or something like that, more easy pay, what have you, you can adjust all of those numbers and it will sort of waterfall throughout this tab. Same thing if you are given some extra acquisition dollars and you're adding an incremental campaign to try to push the volumes, you can reflash your budget here and show an expectation of what that would mean in the sense of revenue, and then counter to that if you need to reduce a little bit, you can show how that works. And really the thing that, as I've gone through this with many folks, that what I've seen that opens people's eyes is just little things. If you say, hey, we need to reduce our acquisition budget by 100 orders a week for 3 months. That doesn't sound like a lot, but over the course of time, as you plug that into this model, and it's 13 weeks times 100, 1,300 orders plus the revenue, all of that goes into that. People tend to be shocked at what kind of an impact that has, on the overall revenue number, anytime you make some sort of a change in that. But in that sense, it greatly helps justify what we're doing, what our goals are, what the revenue contribution is, and how important sales are.
Yeah, it's a great point, Brian, and it can also be used sort of as a tool for really, like you mentioned, describing the impact of reducing your acquisition budget. So I know that's something that a lot of markets are facing these days, is cuts to their acquisition spend, and this tool really allows you to quantify the impact of that reduced spend and that reduced impact from getting those starts in. So that can be useful as well. So the last tab we're going to take a look at here is the summary. And so what this tab does, this is just a small excerpt from it, but it really provides the detail on the observed values that we actually see coming in from the data versus our predictions. And it provides detail on really the major metrics that you're going to be focused on. So you can kind of see here on the far left-hand side, you have your weeks going down the left-hand side. And you also have your total predicted values here. So you have your predicted revenue, volume, and rate. And then what we do is we just carry that across and we compare that to what was actually being realized in the data that we were observing in that particular week in terms of the same metrics. And then we'll calculate the variances or the deltas of those predicted values versus the observed. And so I think one of the major benefits of this sort of approach is that it allows the decision makers involved to drive into revenue misses, or the opposite. If your revenue comes in higher than expectation, you can really dive into why that's happening. So in the first week, for example, it looks like our observed revenue came in about $900 higher than we had predicted in the budget for about 12 basis point delta. And you can really kind of dig in a little deeper to see why that was. So for example, we actually missed the forecast by about 63 accounts in total. It's only 4 basis points, but we were 63 accounts lower than we had predicted. But the average rate ended up being about a full penny higher than we had predicted as well, for about a 16-point delta to the upside. So if you're down 4 basis points on volume but up 16 basis points on rate, you end up with about a 12 basis point delta to the upside. And you can even dive in deeper than this with the budget, but this is just sort of a high-level snapshot. It really gives you a good tool for diving into some of the revenue misses, or if you're missing to the upside as well, we can make tweaks to the budget to kind of better fit what's happening in reality throughout time.
Yeah, to me, this is the key tab in this entire report. And, we basically baseline this thing out like Matthew just described. And once we finalize, our expectations, our plans, we freeze it basically, then we review it, amongst all the market leads. And the beauty in all of this is that instead of, spending a day or two with your circ analyst trying to figure out why you're up or why you're down, you can spend more time, trying to figure out how to solve the problem, not what the problem is. So, it validates. Then beyond that, even if you make some assumptions or some recommendations to address the issue, you can plug that in here and subsequently validate, yes, that's a good idea, or no, that's a bad idea. and at least be moving on your way and being, more, I think, progressive in terms of what you're actually accomplishing, instead of, spending most of your time looking for the root of the problem. You're actually fixing the problem. And I think that's far and away the biggest benefit to this tool that I've seen.
That's a great point. So I think now Brian's going to kind of walk us through some of the things he was trying to solve, with our budgeting approach and some of the things that he's seen so far. So Brian, take it over.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of, review kind of where we're at with Tronc, like I said, we've got multiple markets, very, very distinct and unique markets throughout the country. Everybody does their own unique budget. Everybody has their own process, and it's time-consuming and it's laborious, like it is for most all of us. And everybody has, honestly, their different methodologies in terms of how to work through that. So, I had worked with Mather on a heavier version of this budgeting tool a few years ago, and knowing that probably wasn't likely to be able to be accomplished, knowing that we have 9 or 10 markets here, they've created this lighter version. So we put this in play. The data is very much market specific, like we talked about. Other components mean more to other markets. I mean, in Fort Lauderdale and Orlando, the vacation tool is absolutely important. In markets, like Chicago that are more competitive, honing in on average rates and mix and things like that are incredibly important. But the point of the matter is that we have the history there. So we know what the run rate is. We know what kind of business as usual, I guess you could call it, is, and what sort of deviations we could expect if we go off of that. So, kind of where we've put this is we met individually with every market lead across the company, using the historical data, went through kind of a rollout session with each and said, hey, this is the variance, this is more, or this looks, right on with where we expect it to be. We chased down the cause of the variances, and without fail, we have found it. And then we roll through the history, and then we flashed out the rest of this year. So, we're about 2.5, 3 months into having this, and I can tell you that it's already been very valuable for us in the sense of, as you're coming into fourth quarter, it's incredibly important, for all of us, hitting that final year plan, and making our goals. And, things go up, things go down, but having an idea of what exactly is happening, what we can expect, communicating that up to executive level is very important. So we've used it already for this year. Like Jeff mentioned early on, we're in the throes of budgeting now, locking in revenue, locking in volume expectations. So we will use this as a definitive cross-check, against, what our goals are by market and what our assumptions are for next year. And we'll look at all of these things in the sense of volume and mix and acquisition, and sync it back to expense and revenue, and even volume to a degree, because of some of the attrition data that's in there. So, and then just lastly, like I said, you can monitor and attack, spend less time looking for the problem and more time fixing the problem. That's really kind of what we're looking at going into next year is attacking these things. And, the retention, we kind of glossed over that earlier, but the retention and the attrition numbers that this provides are absolutely key. And as you go through price increases, other marketing campaigns, the call center is absolutely key in all of this. And if you look at your Mather reporting from the pricing, you can see what the revert numbers look like, the change of service numbers look like, the gross versus net increase amounts. All of those things are included in this, and you can see, what that impact is and what small tweaks can mean when you look at the kind of scale that many of us are looking at.
Yeah, Brian, those are great points. And I mean, just for context, Brian and I have been working together on certain budget models, that he alluded to for probably over 5 years now. And his input and feedback, on the versions that we've produced and worked with him on have been really important to developing this lighter, more streamlined version of the model. That's a little bit more flexible, a little bit faster to set up, But yeah, we've really had a great relationship, and it's been, I think mutually beneficial in several regards.
Absolutely.
But just to talk about, Brian kind of mentioned the heavier version of the model. We can touch briefly on a few different versions that we have. And so the screenshots that we took, that we walked through a little bit earlier, were from the lighter version. And that's the version that Brian is working with across Trunk, the 9 properties, major properties that he's leading the charge for. And so that has a few features that are pretty nice. It's definitely the more streamlined version. It has fewer inputs to calculate. Things are calculated at a slightly higher level, and by that I mean we're not really looking at detail at the frequency of delivery level necessarily, or the easy pay level. We tend to aggregate some of those attrition and average rate assumptions up to just a market-wide level. We do break out some detail that we looked at. Generally speaking, anywhere where there are significant differences in behavior, we like to take a deeper look and calculate metrics separately for those groups, and that's primarily for your core and your new starts. Obviously, those subs just exhibit such different behavior from each other. The second detail there is just the full budget, what Brian was referring to, and that's really it's a much bigger endeavor in terms of going in and looking at history and calculating things at a much more granular level. So instead of aggregating things to the market level, what we're doing is we're looking at FA detail, we're looking at start source detail, we're looking at easy pay detail, and we're also kind of breaking down attrition by different subscriber groups, even within tenure. And so it's not just base and new starts, but we're going to be looking at things at subs with 0 to 3 years of tenure, subs with 3+ years of tenure, and kind of getting down into the more nitty-gritty details. That version of the budget can certainly be useful if you're trying to provide third-party verification for your internal budgets, where you need very granular detail, by the FOD level or by the start source channel. That can be helpful. But if you're looking for just overall revenue and overall volume and rate trends, the light version can be very beneficial as well. The last version that we have available is the 3-year subscriber forecast, and that's exactly what it sounds like it is. It's really just a 3-year linked version of the full budget. And what that allows you to do is not only look at the impacts of business rule changes in the next 52 weeks, but you can look at the impact of business rule changes for the next 3 years. So going out quite a long ways to see the impact of changing pricing decisions now, or changing acquisition decisions now. Some of those things can have very long-term implications, and that sort of forecast can help you make some of those decisions in a better way to benefit your business over the long term instead of just over the next year. So in terms of the actual takeaways, from the revenue forecast and the budgeting that we've done so far, we talked about some of the value adds, but the takeaways here are really based off feedback that we've received from markets that we've worked with over the past several years, and especially over the past couple where we've developed these other types of tools that are a little more streamlined. The first one is, and Brian touched on this quite a bit, but our tools can really help you provide third-party verification on the approaches that your market leads take internally. And so I know in several cases where there's more of a corporate entity, and within that you have markets across the country, and they all have different leadership teams and different personnel. Every single one of those markets probably has a different approach to getting that home delivery revenue number. And one of the values of our tool is we're going to come in and take the exact same consistent approach regardless of market and location. And so we can give you a better idea, in terms of one approach of what that revenue number is going to be. So it gives you a check on those different methodologies. The second one is that in some cases we've just completely replaced the internal budgeting team within markets. And so generally that's going to be in smaller markets across the country where perhaps there have been some budget cuts or staff changes, or people have gone to different companies, and so you lose some of the expertise in some cases of folks that have been doing the budgets for a number of years. And so in those cases, we've actually just come in and we perform the main budgeting functions for that market. The third one here is that, we touched on it. It's really making sure the models are as flexible as possible. And so Brian talked a little bit about, how he actually he takes this tool himself and actually goes in and adjusts the numbers on that data input tab. You can do that on the fly in meetings, and everything updates very quickly, so you can kind of get a good gauge on what different scenarios are going to look like. The next one here is just that, we talked about it's a very consistent approach. So for senior executives like Brian and folks like him across the industry, having an approach that's the exact same across the market is really valuable, because you're not dealing with the idiosyncrasies of personalities and different approaches to how they get the number. And the last one here, which is probably the most important, is you always have access to the resources here. We get a lot of feedback that just being able to pick up the phone and call your analyst that you've been working with for a year or two or more is always very valuable. And so it's a nice resource to have, having live help here to be able to help you.
And Matthew, I can jump in on that just to, I guess, testify to that to a degree with the things that we've done here, and it sort of goes back to the flexibility of the model itself. Lots of questions that we've posed, and your guys are always there and ready to help. I know I appreciate that, and any of your other clients do as well.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. It's something we take a lot of pride in, so we appreciate that.
All righty.
So I
believe. Go ahead.
No, Jeff, it's all yours. That was all done.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. We do have some questions, and I'd like to go over those quickly. The first one is, are we talking about a new tool, or is this part of the pricing process that many of us already use? Matthew?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so this process that we're talking about here is a separate initiative. And so as a part of the market-based pricing process, we do generate those incremental pricing forecasts. The issue is that when we're talking about overall home delivery revenue, the pricing revenue is only a small component. Usually it's only going to be anywhere from 2 to, let's say, 5% of overall revenue. So this tool is really integral to being able to fit that pricing revenue into the whole 52-week forecast for HD revenue.
All right, thank you. Next question. What is the accuracy scale goal for revenue forecast? For example, is it plus minus 5%, or what would my expectation be?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is as close as we can possibly get it. We've had instances where we've actually we did a budget for Brian a number of years ago where we are actually on a several $million budget. Obviously, we were only about $1,000 off at the end of the year, so it was smaller than a basis point. And while that's not the standard, we definitely we try to be in the range of a couple of percentage points or under. And normally that's achievable minus any sort of shocks to the system. If there's delivery issues, or if there's some sort of change to the product that wasn't accounted for, sometimes that can throw those off. But like we mentioned before, we always make sure the budgets are updated, and we can always go in mid-year and account for those types of shifts. So if there are shocks that may fundamentally change your path on attrition for your core subs, we can always go in and update that and make sure that the remainder of the year is accounting for those types of things.
All right. Does the new start schedule consider different frequencies of delivery?
Also a good question. And so, yeah, so the two versions of the budget are going to address that question a little differently. So the light version, the streamlined version that we looked at, is just a singular new start schedule. So it's looking at overall starts aggregated across FOD, EasyPay, and channel. The full budget, the one that we used to do years ago for Brian, does have a much more granular breakout for your new starts, and so that's usually going to be at the FOD level, and we occasionally also break that out by the start source channel. And in that case, we go into much more detail about calculating attrition for, say, 7-day kiosk starts versus 7-day voluntary starts, instead of just blending all those things together into a new start attrition where that is the case in the light version.
Thank you. All right, one more, or no, two more actually. On the summary report, is it considering pricing and stops, not just new starts?
Yeah, it sure is. And so that summary tab is actually the result of all of those inputs that we considered on that first slide. And so that's going to include the pricing from Mather. It's going to include the new starts, and it's also going to include the retention components for your core, your new starts, and anybody that's being priced. So it's really the product of all the variables that are placed as inputs in the model.
All right, last question that I have, and this is actually a really good one. How long does it take to put this model together?
That's a great question. And so normally, if we already have data in-house on your market, and usually that's the case if we're working with you on pricing, it's really it only takes a couple of weeks to get a model up and running. Obviously, if we're doing the full budget version, that can take a little bit longer because we have to break out some calculations a few extra ways. And so, it's usually a pretty quick process, usually just a couple of weeks. I think Brian can probably attest to this. We were rolling out 1 to 2 budgets a week for his company for about a month and a half, and we were hitting that schedule pretty well. So once we get a process in place that you guys are comfortable with and we have the data, we can roll them out pretty quick.
Yeah, I'll vouch for that. I mean, we had a couple markets that had just gone through a system conversion, so we actually started there knowing that they would probably be the biggest challenge. So those each took a couple of weeks, but after we got through those and we had, kind of transitioned into the markets that had, been settled for a while, yeah, they were doing 2 a week for probably the last 3 weeks of the project.
Thanks, Matthew and Brian. Thanks to both of you on that. All right, I think that was the last question. Let me check real quick. That's the last question that I have. So as we wrap up here, first, Matthew, Brian, just thanks to both of you for your time and expertise today, guys. Really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to also just thank the audience that hung in there with us and asked some great questions. And if you come up with a question after we're done here and want to get an answer to that question, you can see on the screen. Just send it to webinars@mathereconomics.com. That's webinars@mathereconomics.com, and we certainly will get an answer for you. And lastly, a copy of this slide deck and a recording will be mailed to everyone who registered for the event. So we appreciate that. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.